My fiancé's phone rang at 2 a.m., and he just let it ring. The night was quiet in the way only deep night can be, the kind of quiet that feels heavy rather than peaceful. The house was still, the air unmoving, and the only sound I could hear was the soft rhythm of our breathing. I remember thinking how rare that silence felt lately, how even sleep seemed like a fragile truce between thoughts that never fully rested. I was half awake, floating somewhere between dreaming and consciousness, when the sound cut through the room. A phone rang, not loud, not frantic, just persistent enough to demand attention. It took a second for my mind to register what was happening. The glow from the screen lit the edge of the nightstand, a pale blue rectangle in the dark. 2 a.m., the time burned itself into my awareness instantly. There are some hours that carry meaning without explanation, and 2 in the morning is one of them. Nothing good ever calls at that hour. Emergencies, secrets, regrets, unfinished stories, those are the things that ring at 2 a.m. I waited for him to move. I expected a groan, a shift, the familiar reach of his hand toward the phone. I expected confusion, annoyance, maybe even panic. Instead, there was nothing. His body didn't change. His breathing didn't hitch. He didn't turn his head. He didn't even open his eyes. The phone kept ringing between us like a question neither of us wanted to ask. At first, I thought maybe he was asleep more deeply than I was. That maybe exhaustion had claimed him completely. I told myself not to read into it, not to jump to conclusions in the dark when thoughts are always louder than logic. But something about the stillness felt deliberate. It wasn't the stillness of someone unaware. It was the stillness of someone choosing not to react. The phone rang until it stopped. No voicemail alert followed. No second call immediately after. Just silence again, heavier now, charged with something unspoken. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my heart beating faster than it should have, replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind. The sound of the ringtone lingered like an echo, even after it was gone. I turned my head slightly and studied his face in the dim light. He looked calm, too calm. His expression hadn't changed at all, as if nothing had interrupted the night. That's when the first thought crept in, uninvited and unwelcome. He knew who it was. The certainty of it settled into my chest before I could argue with myself. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't sleep. This was recognition. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from what you see, but from what you understand without proof. I didn't know who was calling. I didn't know why, but I knew he knew. And that knowledge sat between us like a third presence in the bed, cold and awake. I didn't ask him about it. Not then. I told myself there would be time in the morning, when daylight could soften the edges of whatever this was. I told myself I didn't want to overreact, didn't want to be the kind of person who interrogates a missed call in the middle of the night. I lay there pretending to sleep until my breathing matched his again, even though sleep never came back to me. Morning arrived slowly, dragging light across the walls. He woke before I did, or at least before I pretended to. I felt the shift in the mattress as he sat up, and heard the familiar sounds of him getting ready for the day. Everything was normal, too normal, the kind of normal that feels rehearsed after something goes wrong. While he was in the shower, I did something I had never done before. I picked up his phone. My hands felt unsteady, not from guilt but from anticipation. I wasn't looking for messages or photos or proof of betrayal. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I think I just needed confirmation that what I felt in the dark hadn't been imagined. I unlocked the screen and went to the call log. The number was there. One missed call at 2:03 a.m., no name attached, just digits. And then I saw it. The number was blocked, not recently deleted, not ignored, blocked with intention. The realization hit me harder than the ringing had. Blocking a number isn't accidental. It's a decision made after thought, after emotion, after history. You don't block someone unless you know exactly who they are and exactly what they represent in your life. Blocking is a boundary, but it can also be an avoidance. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to, my mind racing through possibilities. An ex, maybe, a wrong number that had become persistent, someone from work who crossed a line. I tried to rationalize it, to shrink it into something manageable, but none of those explanations matched the stillness from the night before. None of them explained how easily he let it ring. When he came back into the room, towel around his waist, humming softly like nothing had changed, I put the phone down exactly where I'd found it. My heart was pounding, but my face stayed calm. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I smiled when he smiled. I listened when he talked about his day ahead. I played my part perfectly, but something inside me had shifted. All day, my thoughts circled back to that number. I found myself replaying moments from our relationship, searching for cracks I might have missed, small inconsistencies, stories that ended too neatly, emotional reactions that didn't quite match the situation. It wasn't that I suspected infidelity in the traditional sense. It felt deeper than that, more complicated, like an old wound I hadn't known existed had suddenly started bleeding again. By evening, curiosity had turned into a quiet obsession. When he stepped out to run an errand, I did something else I'd never done before. I searched for the number online. It wasn't hard. Sometimes the truth wants to be found. The name appeared on my screen, and with it, a thread I hadn't realized we were standing on. It wasn't someone current, it wasn't someone random, it was someone from his past. Someone he had mentioned once, long ago, in passing, with the kind of vagueness that signals discomfort. He had described her as someone who went through a lot and left it at that. I dug deeper, reading fragments of her story that were available to anyone willing to look. Old posts, shared memories, emotional language that spoke of trust and dependence and eventual devastation. The more I read, the heavier my chest felt. This wasn't a casual ex, this was someone who had been emotionally intertwined with him in a way that left marks, and then it clicked. The reason the call rang unanswered, the reason it was blocked, the reason he didn't even flinch. He wasn't protecting me at that moment, he was protecting himself. That realization hurt more than any imagined betrayal, because silence can look like loyalty on the surface. It can look like restraint, like respect, but sometimes silence is just fear wearing a convincing disguise, fear of confrontation, fear of accountability, fear of facing the damage you left behind. I started to see the night differently. The ringing phone wasn't a threat to our relationship, it was a reminder of something unresolved, something he had buried instead of healed. And by letting it ring, he wasn't choosing me. He was choosing not to deal with her pain, her questions, her continued belief that he was still her safe place. What unsettled me most was the realization that I had been standing in the shadow of that unresolved past without knowing it. I had been building a future with someone who had never fully closed a door behind him, only locked it and hoped it would stay shut. That night, lying in bed beside him again, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was fragile, held together by avoidance and unspoken truths. And I understood something I hadn't before. Silence isn't always the absence of sound. Sometimes it's the presence of everything we refuse to say. That understanding did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, painfully, the way truth usually does when it has been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to things I had previously overlooked. The way he avoided certain topics, the way his stories about the past were carefully edited, stripped of emotional detail, the way he spoke about growth and change without ever mentioning accountability. None of it had alarmed me before. Now, it felt deliberate. I realized that silence had always been his preferred language. When things became uncomfortable, he withdrew. When emotions ran high, he became calm to the point of detachment. I had once mistaken that for emotional maturity. I thought he was grounded, steady, unshaken by chaos. What I was beginning to see instead was someone who had learned how to survive conflict by disappearing inside himself, leaving others to deal with the aftermath alone. The more I reflected, the clearer the pattern became. He didn't end relationships, he outgrew them quietly. He didn't confront pain, he waited for it to dull, and he didn't take responsibility for emotional wreckage. He stepped away and trusted time to clean up behind him. That call at 2 in the morning wasn't an intrusion into our present. It was a reminder that time does not heal what is never acknowledged. I imagined her on the other end of the line, staring at her phone as it rang unanswered. I imagined the courage it must have taken to call at that hour, the desperation of needing to hear a familiar voice, the hope that maybe, just maybe, he would answer this time. And then I imagined the silence she received instead. Not closure, not rejection, just nothing. That was when the weight of it truly settled on me. He had not just hurt her in the past, he was still hurting her now, simply by refusing to face what he had done. And by choosing to marry him without understanding this part of him, I was unknowingly stepping into a story that hadn't finished being told. I considered confronting him immediately. The words formed in my head a dozen different ways. I rehearsed calm conversations and emotional ones. I imagined myself asking simple questions and demanding honest answers. But something stopped me each time. I needed to understand him more before I spoke. I needed to know whether this was something he could face or something he would continue to run from. When I finally brought it up, it wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices or accusations. We were sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming in through the window, the normalcy of the moment almost cruel in its contrast. I asked him about the call. Just that. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. For the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by composure. He told me it was someone from his past who had a hard time letting go. He said blocking the number was the healthiest thing for everyone involved. He said he didn't want to bring old drama into our lives. What he didn't say mattered more than what he did. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say he regretted how things ended. He didn't say he had hurt her. He spoke about the situation as if it were an inconvenience, not a consequence. As if emotional damage were something that simply happens, not something caused. I asked him why he didn't answer. He said there was nothing left to say. That was the moment I understood everything. There was plenty left to say. There always is when someone has been left emotionally undone. but saying it would require him to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that he had once been someone's safe place, and then abandoned that responsibility without explanation. Answering the phone would have meant facing himself, and that was what he was truly avoiding. I didn't push further, I didn't argue, I didn't demand more details, I simply listened. And in that listening, I heard the truth beneath his words. He was not cruel, he was not malicious, but he was profoundly avoidant. He moved through life leaving emotional loose ends, trusting that distance would excuse him from responsibility. In the days that followed, I turned inward. I asked myself difficult questions I had never considered before. Was I prepared to build a life with someone who avoided emotional accountability? Could I trust that when things became difficult between us, he would stay present instead of retreating into silence? Would I someday become another blocked number, another unresolved chapter he preferred not to revisit? Love can make us generous to a fault. It can convince us that our understanding will inspire change, that patience will be rewarded, that stability will naturally lead to emotional growth. But love alone does not teach someone how to face their past. That work requires intention, courage, and humility. And I was no longer sure he had any of those when it came to emotional responsibility. I thought about the future we had planned. The shared routines, the milestones, the promises. I imagined moments of conflict, of loss, of deep emotional need. I pictured myself reaching out in my own moment of vulnerability and wondered whether he would answer, or whether he would let it ring because it was easier than engaging with pain. The most painful realization was this. His silence that night had not been loyalty to me, but it also had not been indifference to her. It was fear. Fear of reopening wounds. Fear of being seen as the villain in someone else's story. Fear of accepting that good intentions do not erase harmful impact. And fear, when left unexamined, becomes a pattern. I did not end the engagement immediately. Real life is rarely that clean. There were conversations, long and difficult ones. There were moments of hope and moments of deep disappointment. I told him what I saw, what I feared, what I needed. I asked him directly whether he was willing to confront his past honestly, not just for me, but for himself. He listened. He acknowledged some things, he deflected others. Growth, I learned, cannot be negotiated into existence. It either happens because someone is ready, or it does not happen at all. What stayed with me most was not the call itself, but what it revealed. That silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice, and sometimes it is the loudest declaration of who someone truly is. I thought about her again, weeks later, and hoped she would eventually find peace that did not depend on his recognition. I hoped she would stop calling numbers that would never answer. I hoped she would find a safe place within herself, because the one she trusted had failed her. As for me, I learned something invaluable before it was too late. I learned that the past does not stay buried simply because we refuse to look at it. It waits, it resurfaces, and it speaks, often at the most inconvenient hours. I learned that love without accountability is fragile, and that emotional courage matters just as much as emotional connection. That night at 2 a.m. changed the way I listened to silence. I no longer mistake it for peace. I no longer assume it means loyalty or strength. I understand now that silence can be avoidance, and avoidance, left unchecked, can quietly shape an entire life. The phone rang, he let it ring, and in that moment, without saying a word, he told me everything I needed to know. Subscribe for more stories like this where one moment changes everything.